Welcome to the Sleep Science channel. I'm glad you found your way here. Maybe it's been a long day, or maybe your mind simply hasn't quieted down yet. Sometimes it feels like the body is ready to rest, but something inside stays just a little too alert. Not busy, just watchful. It's a strange kind of tension, not loud, but constant, as if something is still being processed, even when nothing needs our attention anymore. That's because the brain doesn't fully shut off at night. It slows, but it keeps listening. Not just to sounds around you, but also to the absence of sound. And in that silence, the mind can sometimes start hearing things that aren't actually there. A hum, a tone, a faint ringing that doesn't seem to stop. And once you notice it, it's hard to unnotice. This video is made for moments like that, with slow pacing, soft narration, and very little change, to give your mind something neutral to follow. If you find yourself coming back often, you're welcome to subscribe only if and when that feels right. Tonight we're exploring something that many people live with quietly. A sound that doesn't come from outside, but from inside the brain itself. Tinnitus is a word that describes a sound no one else can hear. For some, it's a high-pitched tone that drifts in and out. For others, it's a hum, or a faint buzzing, or a ringing that never fully leaves. It can be steady or shifting, loud or soft, pulsing or continuous. But what makes it strange isn't just the sound itself. It's where the sound comes from, or rather, where it doesn't come from. Because unlike most sounds, tinnitus is not caused by something happening in the outside world. It is not carried through the air, or created by an object, or heard by others. It is generated internally, often deep within the auditory system, and experienced as though it were real. The brain treats it like any other sound. It reacts to it, focuses on it, sometimes even fears it. But there is no external source, just a signal without origin, a sound without a cause you can see. The first time someone notices tinnitus, it can feel like a mystery, a sound that appears in the middle of silence. Sometimes it comes after a concert, or after exposure to loud noise, or after a stressful period. Sometimes it appears gradually, becoming more noticeable at night. And sometimes it begins suddenly, with no clear reason. What follows can vary. For some, the sound fades after a short time. For others, it lingers. And when it lingers, it can become part of everyday life, part of the mental landscape, something to work around or work with, or simply notice and forget again. But forgetting is not always easy, especially when the mind is tired, especially when the room is quiet, especially when the brain is still listening. To understand why tinnitus occurs, it helps to think about how hearing works. Not just the ears, but the whole system involved in turning vibrations into meaning. The process begins in the ear, where sound waves enter and cause tiny structures to move. These movements are converted into electrical signals, which travel through the auditory nerve to the brain. But hearing is not just a one-way signal. The brain plays an active role in shaping what we hear. It filters background noise, fills in missing pieces, and focuses attention on certain frequencies while ignoring others. It adapts constantly, adjusting to new environments, new volumes, new expectations. It listens not just to the world, but to itself. When something in the auditory system changes, when there is damage to the tiny hair cells in the inner ear, for example, the brain may receive less input than it expects. The quiet becomes too quiet, and in response, The brain doesn't simply accept the silence. It turns up its sensitivity. It listens harder. And in listening harder, it may begin to create sound where none exists. A phantom signal, a false perception, not imagined, but internally generated. This is one of the leading theories about tinnitus, that it is the result of a brain adapting to reduced input by amplifying its own noise floor. Not consciously, not intentionally, just as part of a system trying to stay in balance. But tinnitus is not always caused by hearing loss. It can also occur in people with normal hearing. And it can be linked to many other factors: stress, tension, injury, illness, medication. The auditory system is closely connected to other systems in the body, including those that regulate emotion, memory, and attention. This means that what we hear and how we hear it is influenced by more than just the ear. It is shaped by mood, expectation, and experience. In some cases, tinnitus may be triggered by a period of emotional stress, even when nothing has changed physically. In other cases, it may be connected to issues with the jaw or the neck, or blood flow in nearby vessels. There is no single cause and no single pattern. Each person's experience is slightly different. Each sound has its own character. The brain doesn't like unexplained signals. It tries to assign meaning to everything it perceives. This is helpful most of the time. It allows us to make sense of the world quickly. But in the case of tinnitus, the brain's need to interpret can make the sound more persistent. When a tone is perceived and no obvious source is found, it becomes uncertain. And uncertainty tends to hold our attention. The sound becomes something to monitor, to check on, to explain. And the more attention it receives, the more noticeable it becomes. This creates a kind of feedback loop. Attention increases perception. Perception increases attention. The sound becomes part of a cycle that is difficult to break. It's important to know that tinnitus itself is not dangerous. It is not a sign that something is going wrong in the brain. It is a response, a symptom of something the brain is trying to manage. And while it can be uncomfortable or frustrating or even distressing, it is not a threat. But because it is linked to the systems that process emotion, it can easily become part of a larger experience of anxiety or sleep disruption. Not because the sound itself is loud, but because of how the nervous system reacts to it. The sound becomes a signal that something isn't right, and in trying to avoid it, the brain gives it more space. Some people describe their tinnitus as feeling louder when they are stressed, or tired, or overwhelmed. Others say it becomes more prominent when they are alone or when everything else is quiet. This is not a coincidence. The perception of sound is shaped by the context in which it is heard. In a noisy room or a busy street or during a conversation, the brain focuses on external input. The tinnitus is still there, but it is masked, blended into the background. In a quiet room with fewer competing signals, the same tone feels sharper. Not because it has changed, but because there is nothing to cover it. That's why some forms of sound therapy can help reduce the perceived intensity of tinnitus. Not by removing the sound, but by providing something else for the brain to focus on. Gentle background noise, white noise, pink noise, nature sounds, soft music can create a context in which the tinnitus is less noticeable. This doesn't cure the sound, but it gives the auditory system something else to work with. It reduces the contrast between silence and signal. And over time, this can help the brain recategorize the tinnitus as unimportant. as something it no longer needs to monitor. This process is called habituation. It's the brain's way of learning to ignore a stimulus that has no consequence. We do this all the time without thinking. The ticking of a clock, the hum of a refrigerator, the feel of clothing on the skin. At first, these sensations are noticeable. But as the brain recognizes that they don't matter, it begins to filter them out. With tinnitus, habituation can take longer, especially if the sound has been linked to stress or discomfort. But it is still possible. And many people find that over time, the sound fades from awareness, not because it disappears, but because it loses its hold. Sleep can be one of the hardest times for people with tinnitus, not just because the room is quiet, but because sleep requires a kind of surrender, a letting go of control. And tinnitus can feel like something that resists that surrender. A reminder that the mind is still active, still watching, still listening. And in trying to push it away, it becomes more present. This is why gentle distraction, soft audio, slow explanations, even the quiet rhythm of a voice can be helpful. Not to drown the sound, but to coexist with it, to allow the mind to rest beside it rather than against it. There's something interesting about the way the brain responds to signals it can't explain. It doesn't just hear it assigns significance. Sound in the room may be ignored if it's familiar, but the same sound, if unexpected, can trigger alertness. The same applies to internal signals. If a sound feels familiar, unimportant, and safe, the brain may let it fade into the background. But if it feels new or uncertain or potentially meaningful, the brain holds on. Tinnitus often becomes more noticeable not because it has changed, but because our relationship to it has. That relationship can change again. Some researchers believe that the key to reducing the impact of tinnitus lies not in stopping the sound, but in altering the emotional and cognitive response to it. This might involve learning how to observe the sound without judgment, how to notice it without reacting to it, how to coexist with it without giving it power. This is easier said than done, especially when the sound feels intrusive, but it reflects something important about how perception works. What we experience is not just the raw input of our senses. It is the result of what we notice, what we expect, and what we believe about the signal itself. The brain is always learning, always adapting, even in rest, even in sleep. And that means the perception is not fixed. It can shift, it can soften, it can let go. Not through force, but through familiarity, through context, through gentle repetition. Over time, the signal that once felt overwhelming may begin to feel like just another sound. Not pleasant, not welcome, but not threatening either. Just there. And once it's just there, it becomes easier to forget. Tinnitus isn't always constant. For some, it comes and goes. It may be louder in the evening, then barely noticeable during the day. It might shift in pitch or volume, or change depending on posture, environment, or state of mind. Some people even notice that clenching their jaw, moving their neck, or turning their head can slightly alter the quality of the sound. This suggests that the perception of tinnitus isn't only auditory. It may also be influenced by somatosensory input, the same kind of input that helps the brain track movement and position. In a way, tinnitus becomes a blend of sensory experiences filtered through the brain's effort to make sense of incomplete information. This blending of input may help explain why tinnitus feels so different for each person. The brain is constantly integrating signals from the body and the environment. And when one type of input is reduced or distorted, such as through hearing loss or sensory tension, the system adapts. But adaptation doesn't always mean correction. Sometimes it means improvisation. The brain fills in the gaps with what it thinks should be there. And sometimes what it adds is a steady tone or a pulsing rhythm or a sound that no one else can hear. Not because anything is broken, but because the brain is always trying to complete the picture, even when the picture is incomplete. In some cases, tinnitus begins after a single event: a loud noise, an illness, a change in medication. In others, there is no obvious starting point. The sound simply appears, quietly at first, then more noticeably. It may start in one ear or in both. It may feel like it's inside the head or coming from a particular direction or nowhere in particular. The uncertainty is often what makes it more difficult to ignore. When the brain can't find a source, it keeps searching. And the act of searching reinforces the perception. The tone becomes more central not because it's increasing, but because attention is tightening around it. It is believed that stress can play a large role in this process. Not just emotional stress, but also physiological stress. Strain on the nervous system, tension in the body, disruptions in rest or recovery. When the system is on alert, even at a low level, it becomes more sensitive to input. Small sounds feel louder, minor discomfort feels sharper. The threshold for noticing things is lowered. And once the brain learns to monitor a certain signal, it's difficult to stop. Tinnitus may then become part of a pattern. Stress increases awareness, awareness increases distress, and the cycle continues. But just as the brain can learn to focus on a sound, it can also learn to let it fade. This process isn't always fast. It doesn't always feel linear, but it reflects the brain's natural ability to adapt. Over time, with enough neutral exposure, the sound loses its emotional weight. It becomes less interesting, less important, less tied to vigilance. And that shift from reaction to indifference is often what makes the greatest difference in how tinnitus is experienced. There are periods when tinnitus feels more noticeable, even for those who have become used to it. This can happen during illness, during travel, after changes in routine, or during times of heightened emotion. The nervous system, when strained, tends to reopen loops that were once quiet. But this doesn't mean the sound has returned permanently or that progress has been lost. It simply reflects a temporary change in how the brain is allocating its attention. When stability returns, the perception often softens again. And this ebb and flow is part of the natural rhythm of adaptation. People sometimes ask whether tinnitus means something is wrong with their brain, whether it points to something deeper or more serious. But in the vast majority of cases, tinnitus is not a sign of damage in the brain itself. It is not linked to cognitive decline or loss of function or long-term neurological harm. It is a perceptual experience, a sign of the brain doing what it always does, interpreting input, adjusting to changes, and filling in missing information. It becomes problematic not because of its presence, but because of how it interacts with the systems that manage attention and stress. Some studies suggest that the more energy we spend trying to suppress a sensation, the more likely we are to notice it. The act of monitoring becomes the act of reinforcing. This is why acceptance-based approaches have become more common in tinnitus care. Rather than fighting the sound, the goal is to stop reacting to it, not because the sound is harmless in itself, but because The reaction is what creates discomfort. The reaction is what activates the nervous system, tightens the muscles, and keeps the mind restless. When the reaction softens, the sound often follows. This doesn't mean the sound will disappear. For many people, it stays. But its role in daily life changes. It becomes less central, less controlling, less charged. People describe this shift as a kind of fading, not in volume, but in presence. The sound is there, but it no longer matters. It no longer triggers the same mental loop. And with time, it may fall below the threshold of attention altogether. This is the process of habituation, and it can happen gently, gradually, even without effort, as long as the system feels safe enough to let go. There are moments when tinnitus seems to rise in intensity even without any external change. This can feel frustrating or confusing, but it often reflects internal shifts in mood, in sleep, in body tension. The sound hasn't become louder. The system has simply become more sensitive. This is similar to how pain can fluctuate without injury, or how emotions can feel stronger when we are tired. The brain's filters are not fixed. They move with us, and so does our perception. Night is often when these filters are thinnest. The quiet that surrounds us at bedtime allows certain things to emerge more clearly, not because they are new, but because everything else has fallen away. Tinnitus in this context feels more present, not because the sound has changed, but because the mind is now less distracted, and the instinct to resist it, to block it, to push it away, can make it feel even closer. This is why sleep becomes a challenge for some. Not because of the sound alone, but because of the mental stance toward the sound. Because of the sense that silence is no longer silent. Still, many people sleep well with tinnitus, not because they have found a cure, but because they have found familiarity. The sound becomes known, expected, background. And the moment it loses its sense of threat, the nervous system stops reacting. Sleep becomes possible again. This doesn't always happen quickly, but it happens. And once it does, the mind begins to rebuild trust in its own ability to rest. There are times when tinnitus is linked to other sensations: pressure in the ears, dizziness, a feeling of fullness or imbalance. These experiences may point to physical changes in the ear or surrounding structures. In some cases, medical evaluation can help identify treatable causes. But even when no clear source is found, the perception remains real, and the path forward remains the same. Not elimination, but adaptation. Technology has offered new ways to support this adaptation. Sound machines, hearing aids with masking functions, smartphone apps with calming tones. These tools can create a richer sensory environment, not to hide the tinnitus, but to offer something else for the brain to relate to, a broader field, a less narrow focus. Over time, this can retrain the system to respond less sharply to the tinnitus itself. But it's not always about tools. Sometimes the greatest shift comes from understanding, from knowing that the sound is not a sign of danger, that it's not a failure of the brain, that others experience it too, that it doesn't have to interfere with meaning or rest or peace, that it can be there and life can still be full. The more the brain hears that message, not just intellectually but physiologically, the more it begins to relax its grip. The sound remains, but it no longer defines the moment. It no longer shapes the entire night. Tinnitus is part of a much larger story, one of perception, attention, adaptation, and resilience. It reveals how deeply connected our systems are, how the body, the mind, and the environment work together to shape experience, and how even a single tone heard by no one else can teach us something about how we relate to the world around us. There is something quietly revealing about how the brain handles sound. It never simply records, it interprets, it filters, it guesses. Even in silence, the auditory system is active, always listening, always anticipating. When external input is reduced, the system doesn't stop. It becomes more sensitive. And in that increased sensitivity, even the smallest internal signals can become meaningful. A mild fluctuation becomes a steady tone, a faint hum becomes a presence. The system interprets these fragments as sound because it is built to interpret. This is not a flaw, it's how perception works. We are not just receivers of data, we are builders of experience. Some people describe their tinnitus as a part of them, not a separate thing, but something that now lives in the background of thought, like a scar or a memory or the ticking of a clock that has become too familiar to notice. This doesn't happen all at once. There is often resistance first, a period of trying to fix it, remove it, silence it. But over time, that resistance softens, not because the sound becomes better, but because the relationship to it changes. Familiarity, even with something unwanted, makes it less threatening. The brain no longer feels the need to react. The signal loses its urgency. And with that, it often loses its grip. It is natural to want quiet, to crave silence after a loud day or a long one. And when silence arrives but brings a tone with it, that contrast can feel jarring. The very thing we hoped would bring rest becomes the moment we notice the sound most. But this moment, too, is an opportunity. Not to chase the sound away, but to witness how the brain fills silence, to observe the process, to recognize that what we hear is not always about the world outside, but about the brain's interpretation of stillness. There are parallels here with other systems in the body. When vision is impaired, the brain fills in missing information based on expectation. When touch is reduced, sensations may become amplified in strange ways. The same is true for sound. The auditory system doesn't like gaps. It tries to make things complete. Tinnitus in this sense is not a glitch. It is a sign of the brain trying to maintain continuity in the absence of full input. Like a radio searching for a signal and holding on to the closest frequency it can find, even if it's just static. Understanding this doesn't always make the experience easier, but it adds context. It reminds us that the sound is not a punishment or a warning. It is a side effect of a system doing its best to adapt. And when adaptation is understood, it can be supported. Not through force, but through acceptance. Through the creation of new patterns, through consistent signals that say, this sound is not a threat. This sound does not require vigilance. This sound can be present while life continues. Some people use gentle background audio during sleep, not because it eliminates tinnitus, but because it provides a framework for attention, a soft anchor, a neutral focus. The brain prefers signals that are steady, non-threatening, and familiar. In the presence of such signals, the mind can loosen its hold on internal noise. This is not distraction in the shallow sense, but recalibration, a way to remind the auditory system that not all silence needs to be filled with tension. The tone of tinnitus can vary. Some describe a high-pitched ring, others a low hum. Some hear clicking or chirping or pulsing. These variations may reflect different points along the auditory pathway, where the signal is being generated or modified. In some cases, the tone changes throughout the day. In others, it remains stable. But what remains true across experiences is that the meaning of the sound, my church, is not just its form, shapes the brain's response to it. When the tone is linked to stress or fear, the response becomes tighter. When it is linked to safety or predictability, the response becomes looser. This helps explain why certain environments or routines can influence how tinnitus is perceived. A calm morning, a warm shower, a quiet walk, a steady voice. These experiences don't eliminate the sound, but they soften the nervous system's reactivity. They remind the body what safety feels like. And in safety, the brain is less likely to amplify small signals. The system begins to rebalance. It is also worth remembering that sleep itself changes how the brain processes sound. During lighter stages of sleep, the auditory system still monitors the environment. But as sleep deepens, reactivity drops. Tinnitus may still be present, but awareness fades. It does not prevent the body from resting. And over time, as sleep becomes more consistent, the mind becomes more resilient. The sound loses the power to interrupt. In moments of wakefulness, especially during the night, it may feel as though tinnitus is a barrier, a wall between the mind and rest. But this impression often comes from the way attention behaves when stimulation is low. Without the busyness of daytime, the mind turns inward. It scans, it evaluates, and the presence of tinnitus becomes one of the things it notices most. Not because it is louder, but because the contrast has grown. This is a normal shift, not a sign of worsening, but of the brain doing what it always does, trying to understand its surroundings, even when the surroundings are still. There are strategies that can support this transition, not as solutions, but as companions. Breathing that is steady, not controlled. Movement that is gentle, not forced. Sound that is quiet, not silent. Environments that are dim, not dark. These small choices create a sense of ease, and ease allows the nervous system to settle. When the system settles, perception settles too. The sound may remain, but its edge softens. Its presence becomes less pointed, more background, less central. It is common to wonder if tinnitus will ever go away. For some, it does fade completely. For others, it becomes part of life. But in both cases, what matters most is not the sound itself, it is the space around it. The ability to live without reacting to it, to rest even when it's there, to move through the day without needing it to change. That space is where peace grows. Not through silence, but through freedom. And freedom begins when the sound no longer defines the moment, when it no longer shapes the mood, when it is allowed to be present without being in control. This does not mean giving up. It means giving less energy to something that feeds on attention. It means redirecting that energy toward what brings calm, meaning, or connection, toward what supports the system in feeling safe. Because when the system feels safe, the brain doesn't need to listen so closely. It doesn't need to monitor every frequency. It can let some signals fade. And when those signals fade, not because they've vanished, but because they've lost their urgency, the mind finds more space, more quiet, more stillness. Even if the sound is still faintly there, it no longer holds the spotlight. This is the shift that happens over time, slowly, imperceptibly, and yet powerfully. The tone that once felt constant now drifts. The presence that once felt consuming now recedes. Not every moment, not every night, but more often, more gently. and eventually it becomes just one part of a larger experience. No longer central, no longer sharp, just part of the quiet. There are many ways to describe the experience of tinnitus, but almost all of them circle back to one simple feeling. It's always there, or at least it seems to be, even if it fades during conversation, or disappears into the noise of a city, or vanishes for a few hours during a busy day. There's often a sense that it will return. This awareness creates a kind of anticipation, a quiet readiness. And that readiness can be exhausting. Not because of the sound itself, but because of the way the mind waits for it, watches for it, holds a space open for it. When the brain becomes accustomed to monitoring a signal, it often keeps doing so even after the signal becomes irrelevant. This is not a malfunction, it's a form of safety. The same mechanism allows us to wake up to the faint cry of a baby or the distant beep of an alarm. But with tinnitus, the signal doesn't come from outside. So the vigilance never quite ends. And when the mind is in a vigilant state, even soft tones feel important. The brain flags them for review. It asks, is this meaningful? Is this something I need to fix? Is this a sign of something I should not ignore? This is why tinnitus can feel louder in moments of rest. The stillness around it allows the mind to focus on it without interruption. This focus is not always conscious. It happens in the background. Quiet, persistent. A thread of awareness that loops around itself. But awareness takes energy, even subtle awareness, and over time, that energy becomes fatigue. The listener becomes tired not just from hearing the sound, but from noticing it, thinking about it, responding to it. It becomes a kind of mental habit, one that feels automatic, but like all habits, it can change. With patience, with context, with new signals that say, this sound is not danger, this sound is not urgent, this sound can exist without controlling the moment. One of the most powerful tools the brain has is contrast. It uses contrast to decide what matters, what stands out, what deserves attention. In a quiet room, tinnitus becomes the highest signal. The contrast between it and everything else is sharp. In a room with soft sound, not noise, but gentle auditory texture, that contrast is reduced. The brain has more to choose from. It's not tricked. It still knows the tinnitus is there, but it no longer needs to highlight it so intensely. This is why some people find relief in using subtle soundscapes, fans, or soft tones during rest. Not to eliminate the sound, but to reduce the contrast, to make the auditory world feel less empty and the tinnitus feel less alone. The emotional layer of tinnitus is just as real as the auditory one. If a sound is linked with stress, discomfort, or helplessness, the brain flags it as a threat. That flag keeps the system on alert. Even if consciously we know the sound is harmless, the nervous system may not respond that way. It may stay activated, and when the system is activated, sleep becomes more difficult, rest becomes lighter, thoughts become quicker. It is a loop that maintains itself even if it began with something very small. And in this way, a single tone can become an entire experience, not because of its volume, but because of its associations. But just as the brain can build these associations, it can also unbuild them, not through suppression, but through exposure in a safe context. When the tone is present during calm moments, during a slow walk, a warm bath, a relaxed evening, the nervous system begins to pair the sound with safety. This pairing is subtle. It doesn't happen all at once. But over time, the brain learns that the sound is not dangerous, that it has been present many times and nothing bad followed, that it does not need to be tracked, evaluated, or fixed. This is the foundation of habituation, and it is deeply biological. The nervous system wants to rest. It wants to save energy. Once a signal is no longer important, the brain stops highlighting it. It fades naturally into the background. This is not forgetting. It's reclassification. The same thing happens with smells, with repetitive movements, with sensations that don't require attention. At first we notice them, but once we're certain they're safe, they fall away from awareness. Tinnitus can follow the same path. Not for everyone, not completely, but for many people, the path is there. And each time the brain chooses to ignore the signal instead of fixating on it, that path gets a little stronger. There's also something to be said for the passage of time. With each week, each month, each year, the brain becomes more familiar with its own patterns. It becomes better at knowing what to attend to and what to release. Tinnitus that once felt loud and intrusive may begin to feel like a distant part of the background. This change doesn't always feel linear. There may be moments when the sound returns more strongly, times of illness, of exhaustion, of stress, but these moments are temporary. The deeper patterns remain. The brain remembers the calm, and it returns to that baseline more easily with each cycle. Sleep is one of the most delicate times for people with tinnitus. The body slows, the world quiets, and the sound becomes more obvious. But sleep is also one of the most powerful allies in softening perception. During deep rest, the brain rebalances its sensory thresholds. It decides what to keep, what to discard, what to ignore. And the more consistently we sleep, even imperfectly, the more the auditory system learns to deprioritize non-urgent signals. Tinnitus becomes part of that process, not by being silenced, but by being unimportant, by being just one small part of a larger sensory world. The presence of tinnitus does not mean something is wrong with you. It does not mean your brain is broken or that your body is failing. It means your auditory system is trying to make sense of silence, trying to hold continuity in the absence of input, trying in its own way to stay connected. This effort is not visible, it is not dramatic, but it is real. And understanding that effort, seeing it not as failure, but as adaptation, can bring a quiet kind of reassurance. There are stories from people who once felt overwhelmed by the sound and now live with it calmly, not because they cured it, but because they no longer fight it. It became part of the scenery, part of the normal variation of their senses, a sound among other sounds. This is not about giving up. It's about making space, about letting the nervous system shift from resistance to neutrality, and in neutrality, the mind finds rest. Each time you hear the tone and allow it to pass without reaction, the system learns. Each time you sleep despite its presence, the brain adapts. Each quiet morning, each peaceful evening, each unremarkable moment where the sound was there but didn't matter. These are the threads that slowly reweave your experience. Not with effort, but with time, with consistency, with the soft repetition of safety. This is how the brain changes, not in sharp leaps, but in gentle returns. 1,000 small shifts that slowly build a new normal. And in that new normal, the sound becomes less central. Life becomes wider again. Moments become simpler again. Sleep becomes easier again. Even if the sound is still there, even if nothing changed outside, because something changed inside. This is what it means to adapt. to carry something with you, but no longer feel its weight. There is something remarkably resilient about the human brain. Even when faced with a constant internal signal, something it cannot escape, cannot control, and cannot fully understand, it still finds ways to adapt, to recalibrate, to soften its response. Tinnitus is, in many ways, an invitation to observe that resilience, to see how a system built for survival can also be trained for peace, how something persistent can become something background, how something uncomfortable can become something neutral, not through resistance, but through recognition, through repetition, through familiarity. People sometimes wonder whether they've done something wrong to cause the sound, whether they damaged something without knowing it or missed a warning sign. This feeling is understandable. We are taught to look for causes, for reasons, for explanations that make sense. But in many cases of tinnitus, the cause is not clear. It may be related to past exposure to sound, or a medication, or a moment of stress, or none of these. The origin becomes less important than the response, because whatever started the sound, the experience of it now lives in how the brain relates to it. That relationship is not fixed. Even if the sound does not change, the way it is experienced can. This is why some people notice a shift in their perception over time, even without any specific treatment. The tone that once dominated their awareness now comes and goes. The reaction that once felt automatic becomes less urgent. This shift is not dramatic. It does not always feel like progress in the moment. But over weeks, months, the change becomes clearer. Not because the sound has vanished, but because the brain has stopped needing to guard against it. Guarding is something the brain does when it feels uncertain. It watches, it waits. It keeps a small part of its attention ready to act. This is useful in many situations. It keeps us safe, alert, prepared. But it is tiring when the signal being monitored is not dangerous. Tinnitus can become such a signal. The brain keeps one eye on it, even when there's nothing to be done. And that half-readiness can drain mental energy. It creates a sense of unease, a tension that isn't sharp but constant. And with that comes frustration. Not only because of the sound itself, but because of how it fills the space meant for quiet. This is why learning to coexist with the sound, rather than defeat it, can lead to greater calm. It's not about giving in, it's about recognizing that attention is a resource, that energy spent monitoring the sound can be redirected, not toward ignoring, but toward allowing, toward making room. This small mental shift from resistance to room making is subtle but powerful. It changes the narrative from something happening to you to something happening near you. And what happens near you doesn't have to shape everything inside. Tinnitus is not just a tone, it is a pattern of perception, reaction, and interpretation. Changing that pattern takes time. And time can feel slow when rest is hard. But the brain responds to repetition. Each time you notice the sound without tension, the loop weakens. Each time you sleep while it's present, the brain learns that it doesn't need to respond. These moments add up. They become the new default. Not with a single breakthrough, but with quiet consistency. Many people ask whether masking the sound using external audio to cover it is a good idea. The answer depends on the person. For some, gentle soundscapes create space for rest. For others, they prefer silence, even with the presence of tinnitus. There is no perfect strategy. there is only what supports your nervous system in feeling safe. That safety is the foundation. The sound can remain, but the experience becomes lighter, less loaded, less framed by frustration. In clinical settings, some therapies focus on retraining the brain's response to tinnitus. These include cognitive approaches, behavioral techniques, and sound therapy. But at their core, they all share one idea: that the sound itself is not the problem. It is the meaning attached to the sound, the response it triggers, the fear it carries. When that meaning is softened and when the sound is reframed as familiar, safe, non-urgent, the brain lets go. Not all at once, not entirely, but enough to change the experience. There are people who go days without noticing their tinnitus, even though it is still present. Not because they've stopped hearing it, but because they've stopped tracking it. Their attention has moved elsewhere. The sound is no longer flagged. It is not connected to alarm. It is simply another part of the sensory world, like background light or ambient air. This level of acceptance often comes slowly, but it is not out of reach. It begins with small shifts: a quiet morning, a full night's sleep, a moment where the sound was there, but it didn't stop anything from happening. And over time, these small moments begin to rewire the system. They build trust. They show the brain that attention can move, that sound can exist without urgency, that peace is not about silence, but about space. Space for the sound to be what it is, without defining the whole experience. Tinnitus can also remind us of how adaptable the mind really is, how it recalibrates to new conditions, how it adjusts to changes we never thought we could live with. Think of how the body adjusts to living in a noisy city or beside a railway or with a partner who snores. What feels impossible at first becomes normal, not through forgetting, but through rebalancing. The same is possible with internal sound. The brain's threshold for noticing shifts. What once stood out begins to blend in. This adaptability is part of who we are. It is what allows us to age, to recover, to move through change. And while tinnitus may challenge that adaptability, it also demonstrates it. It shows us that not all discomfort needs to be removed to be resolved. Some discomfort becomes background. Some tension loses its signal. And in that process, the mind becomes less reactive, more settled, more free. So much of the struggle with tinnitus is not about sound, but about control, about the wish to decide what we hear. And when we can't decide, when a sound arrives without our permission and stays, it can feel like we've lost something essential. But perhaps the shift comes when we no longer need to win that fight, when we stop needing to control every signal, when we see that some things, even when they stay, don't need to rule us. This is not surrender, it's perspective. It's the quiet confidence that not every battle is necessary, that the nervous system, when left to its own timing, will recalibrate, that the brain, when given the right conditions, will learn to stop watching the sound. It will hear it, but not highlight it. It will let it pass the same way it lets so many things pass each day. And in this letting pass, there is peace, not silence, not absence, but peace in the presence of the sound. And that kind of peace, the kind that includes rather than excludes, often turns out to be the most lasting of all, because it doesn't depend on conditions changing. It depends on awareness changing, on space opening, on meaning shifting, and the brain is capable of that shift, even when it feels slow, even when it takes longer than we'd like, even when the sound is still there. There is something unique about the sound of tinnitus, not just in its tone or pitch, but in the way it seems to belong to no place. It isn't in the room. It isn't in the air. It doesn't come from any object that can be turned off or moved. And because of this, the mind sometimes doesn't know where to place it. There's no external reference point, no source to locate, no clear boundary around it. This lack of location creates a kind of disorientation. It invites questions. What is this? Why is it here? Will it always be like this? Those questions are understandable. The brain wants to resolve uncertainty. It wants to explain anomalies. But in the case of tinnitus, the explanations are often vague. The signal doesn't fit neatly into one category. It isn't a hallucination. It isn't a malfunction. It is a response, a result of the brain's tendency to search for patterns, to maintain continuity, to listen even when there is nothing to hear. And when the brain listens in silence, it may begin to perceive its own internal activity as external sound, a normal mechanism extended just slightly beyond its usual bounds. And that's why tinnitus often feels most present at the edges of experience, in the quiet of night, in the pause after a conversation, in the moment just before sleep. These are the times when the world falls away and the mind turns inward. And in that inward turn, it becomes more sensitive to internal signals. What was always there becomes newly noticeable. What was previously masked becomes exposed. Not louder, not stronger, simply uncovered. And yet, just as the sound is uncovered by silence, it can be recovered by gentle activity. Not noise, not distraction, but the soft, steady rhythm of something else. A quiet voice, a neutral soundscape, a calm routine. These things don't make the sound disappear, but they do give the mind something else to do, something else to hold. And in that holding, the tone of tinnitus begins to move back into the background. This movement from foreground to background is not forced. It happens through repetition, through the slow reorganization of attention. Attention that is no longer pulled by urgency but guided by familiarity. When the tone is no longer new, it no longer demands the same energy. The brain, like any system, seeks efficiency, and tuning out unimportant information is part of that efficiency. This is why sleep, even with tinnitus, is not only possible but deeply restorative. It may take time, it may feel uneven, but each night of sleep, however imperfect, supports the system in finding balance again. During sleep, the auditory system resets its thresholds. The emotional centers of the brain quiet down. The body releases tension. And the connection between sound and reaction is loosened. There may be nights when the sound feels stronger, when the tone seems to press forward into awareness. This can be discouraging. But these nights do not undo progress. They are simply part of the variability of the system. Just as mood fluctuates as energy rises and falls, so too does the sensitivity of perception. The key is not to chase consistency, but to trust the overall trend. To know that one difficult night does not predict the next. That adaptation continues even when it's not visible. People sometimes wonder what their life would be like without the sound, what they would do with the mental space it now occupies. And these questions can be useful, not for comparison, but for perspective. They remind us that attention is a choice, that the brain, even when aware of something, can learn to give it less space, that space can be used for rest, for thought, for connection, for quiet joy. The sound may remain, but the weight of it does not have to. In conversations with others who experience tinnitus, a common thread appears. At first there is fear, then frustration, then gradually a kind of settling, not always acceptance in the emotional sense, but a practical recognition. The sound is here, it may stay, but I will live with it. And that shift, from questioning to coexisting, changes everything. It brings back a sense of agency, a feeling that even with this tone in the background, life continues. And not just continues, but contains beauty, clarity, and ease. Tinnitus is unusual in that it is invisible to others. It is a solitary experience. No one else can hear it. No one else can measure it. This can create a sense of isolation, especially early on. But the experience is not rare. Millions of people live with some form of internal sound, and among those millions, many find peace. Not through elimination, but through adjustment, through the quiet, slow work of rebalancing perception. The work is not dramatic. It doesn't require constant effort. In fact, effort often makes it harder. What helps most is the gentle repetition of safety, the return to normalcy, the quiet confidence that this sound doesn't have to mean anything more than it does. It is not a signal of failure. It is not a flaw in character. It is a byproduct of the brain's sensitivity. A reminder of how finely tuned our perception is. And like all things that arise from the brain's pattern making, it can fade from attention once it is no longer needed. There may be times when the sound seems linked to emotion, when stress makes it rise, when sadness makes it sharp, when anxiety makes it feel unrelenting. These connections are real. The brain does not separate emotion and sensation. They move through the same circuits. But this also means that peace too can be connected. That calm can lower the volume, even when the sound itself has not changed. That joy or stillness or connection can reduce the brain's focus on what once felt inescapable. Some people find it helpful to give the sound a name, not as a way to personalize it, but as a way to change their relationship to it. When something has a name, it becomes less abstract, less mysterious, easier to acknowledge, easier to move past. Others prefer to think of it as a weather pattern, something that comes and goes, that isn't under their control, but also doesn't need to be. However it's framed, the goal is the same: to reduce the sound's grip on attention, to soften the edges of its presence. Even now, as you listen to these words, the sound may come and go in your awareness. It may rise for a moment, then fade again. This is natural. It shows how attention moves. It shows that perception is not fixed, that the tone may be present, but it does not control your focus. It is one part of a much larger field. And the more you return to that larger field, through breath, through sleep, through steady thought, the smaller the sound becomes in context. This is the slow work of the nervous system. The background recalibration that happens not in big steps but in quiet moments. It does not require belief. It does not need force. It only needs space and time and the absence of pressure. Because pressure, the need to change, the demand to fix, the urgency to silence, is what keeps the loop alive. When that urgency fades, the system begins to shift. The brain stops listening so closely. The sound loses its meaning, and what once felt impossible becomes part of the ordinary. Not a burden, not a crisis, just part of how your mind listens in the quiet. When the mind becomes familiar with a signal, it eventually stops highlighting it. This is true for many things. A repetitive noise in your home, the ticking of a wall clock, the hum of distant traffic. At first, they're noticeable, but then, with time, the mind lets them fade into the periphery. It learns that they are safe, predictable, unimportant. And so it stops alerting you to them. Now, they don't vanish, but they lose their place in the spotlight. Tinnitus can be approached in the same way, not as a signal that needs to disappear, but as one that needs to be gently deprioritized, to lose its special status in the hierarchy of awareness. This shift doesn't happen by ignoring the sound. It happens by not reacting to it, by making space around it, letting it exist without resistance. When the brain notices that nothing bad happens in its presence, that rest still comes, that life still moves forward, the importance of the signal is downgraded. Slowly, it blends into the internal landscape. It becomes just another thread in the fabric of experience, not the whole picture. That blending is helped by repetition, by ordinary days, by peaceful evenings, by moments when the tone is present, but nothing else changes. These moments teach the system. They reframe the meaning of the sound. They show the nervous system that it does not need to respond. And with each of these small exposures, the connection between tone and alertness begins to weaken. The volume may not change, but the relationship does. And the relationship is what defines the experience. Some people report that after years of living with tinnitus, they barely think about it. It's not that the sound left them. It's that they stopped giving it meaning. Their attention shifted elsewhere. Their life expanded around it. And the tone, once dominant, became something small, like a distant signal from another room, still present, still real, but no longer the center of everything. This isn't a special kind of strength. It's a natural outcome of the way the brain processes repeated, non-threatening input. Our senses are built to adapt. Even when they encounter strange or persistent signals, they seek a baseline. They want equilibrium, and they adjust their sensitivity to achieve it. In the case of tinnitus, this means that over time, the brain can recalibrate its response. Not by turning the sound off, but by deciding it doesn't matter, by reassigning it to the background. This reassignment is not always conscious. It's a product of safety, of time, of consistent context. For some, that context is aided by soft background noise, something that provides a gentle auditory environment in which the tinnitus feels less isolated. A fan, rainfall, low music. Not to drown it out, but to share the space. This shared space reminds the brain that the internal sound is just one signal among many, that it does not need special attention. Over time, this reduces contrast, and reducing contrast reduces awareness. Other people find that sound masking isn't necessary, that with time, silence itself becomes more comfortable. Not because the tinnitus is gone, but because the silence feels safer. The fear that once accompanied the quiet has faded, and with it, the need to manage or modify the sound has faded too. This return to calm silence is one of the strongest signs of adaptation. Not forced silence, but accepted quiet. There's a difference between awareness and fixation. Being aware of a sound doesn't mean it has control. It simply means it's part of the present moment. Fixation, on the other hand, pulls energy toward the sound. It attaches emotion, urgency, effort. The goal with tinnitus is not to eliminate awareness, but to dissolve fixation, to remove the pressure, to let attention remain wide even when the tone is heard. This is supported by how we think about the sound. If it is framed as dangerous, broken, or threatening, the brain stays alert. If it is framed as neutral, explainable, common, the brain releases it. That release isn't something you have to force. It happens through experience, through evidence. Each time you rest while the sound is there, each time you enjoy something in its presence, that evidence accumulates. The brain updates its internal model. It says, "This sound is not important." Over time, this update becomes permanent, not because you've stopped hearing the sound, but because you've stopped reacting to it. The nervous system is not being triggered. And when it is not triggered, it no longer maintains the loop. That loop, sound, reaction, monitoring, distress, is what gives tinnitus its weight. Without the loop, it is just a tone, a background frequency, something that no longer defines the moment. There may still be fluctuations, days when the sound feels more intense, times when attention drifts back to it. This is not failure, it's just variation, like waves on water. The important thing is how you respond to those moments, whether you feel pulled into the loop again, or whether you simply notice the sound and move on. With practice, the second response becomes easier. The system recovers more quickly, the sound loses its grip. This is not a passive process, it's active in a very quiet way. It involves choosing not to chase, not to resist, not to argue with the signal. Instead, you build a life around it, not in defiance, but in inclusion. You let the sound be there, and you keep going, you sleep, you think, you laugh, you forget, you remember, you exist with it, not because of it. And in doing so, you shrink its influence. One of the most powerful aspects of adaptation is that it often happens when you stop trying, not because giving up is helpful, but because pressure creates tension. And tension is what feeds the loop. When the mind softens, when expectation loosens, the system has room to adjust. And it often does. Not suddenly, not in a way you'll always notice, but gradually, like a light changing through the day. Subtle, persistent, real. You might reach a point where you no longer remember when you last noticed the sound, or where you hear it but feel nothing about it, or where you mention it to someone and realize it hasn't bothered you in weeks. These moments are the quiet signs of change. They come not with celebration, but with calm, a sign that the sound has been absorbed into the wider world of experience, where it no longer stands alone. This is what the mind does best. It adapts. It finds ways to carry things without being burdened by them. It doesn't need perfection. It only needs consistency. And with consistency, even the most persistent sensations become manageable. Even the tones that once seemed to fill every space now occupy less and less of your internal world. Tinnitus will not always feel the way it does now. Even if the sound remains, your relationship to it can and likely will change. The edges will soften, the importance will fade, the presence will grow quieter, not in volume but in meaning, and in that shift, space will return. Mental space, emotional space, rest, focus, stillness. All of it is still possible. And it's already happening in the background as the brain does what it has always done, adjusting, rebalancing, learning, letting go. There's something gentle in recognizing that not everything needs to be solved. Some things just need to be understood. Tinnitus often begins as a mystery, a strange, invisible sound that no one else hears. It leads to questions, investigations, sometimes frustration. And all of that is valid. But at some point, the focus begins to shift. The mind becomes less interested in fixing and more interested in living alongside. The sound is still there, but the story around it changes. It's no longer a puzzle to be solved. It's a condition to be lived with. And with that change comes a sense of calm. Not because everything is better, but because it no longer feels like a threat. This is the power of interpretation. The brain is not just a receiver of signals, but a builder of meaning. Two people can hear the same tone and feel entirely different things about it. One might feel tension, another neutrality. The difference isn't in the sound. It's in the relationship to the sound. And relationships can change. They change through experience, through exposure, through the quiet repetition of normal life. This repetition tells the nervous system, you are safe. You can let go. You don't need to track this. With enough time, that message becomes automatic. The brain stops checking. The sound becomes unremarkable. It may still be audible, but it no longer stirs anything. No tension, no alertness, just a tone. Familiar. Background. The way a faint hum in a building might be. Something you stop noticing, even though it never stopped. This is what adaptation feels like. Not dramatic, but steady. Like a room gradually warming to a comfortable temperature. Many people who live with tinnitus describe a turning point. A moment when their frustration began to lift. Often, this moment isn't marked by a change in the sound itself, but by a change in how they thought about it. It could be a good night's sleep, a full day without paying attention to it, a realization that the sound hadn't ruined anything. These small, quiet victories accumulate. They change the internal narrative. The sound is no longer in control. You are. This sense of control doesn't come from suppressing the sound. It comes from expanding your attention, from letting the sound take up less space, not by force, but by proportion. Life becomes fuller. The sound becomes smaller. It shrinks not in decibels, but in meaning, in presence. It loses the power to shape your entire emotional response. This process is not linear. There will be times when the sound feels louder, when frustration returns. That's part of how the system works. But even in those moments, the brain is still adapting, still learning, still remembering that this signal does not require alarm, that it can be present without being important. These temporary increases do not undo the progress already made. They are simply passing states, not regressions, just variations. The body, too, learns from this pattern. Muscles begin to stay loose. Breathing stays soft. Sleep becomes easier. And when the body is at ease, the mind follows. The loop breaks. The signal weakens. Or rather, the reaction to the signal weakens, and that's what makes the experience lighter. It's also worth noting that the perception of tinnitus isn't just influenced by sound. It's influenced by attention, memory, emotion, expectation. When these factors are calm, the sound tends to be quieter. When they're agitated, the sound can feel sharper. But this also means that anything that supports general well-being and sleep, hydration, gentle movement, meaningful connection, indirectly supports your relationship with the sound. This doesn't mean the goal is to create perfect conditions. Perfection creates pressure, and pressure tightens awareness. The goal is consistency, not control. To live normally even if the tone is there. To return to things you enjoy. To allow moments of peace. Not by forcing the sound out, but by letting other things in. Things that remind the brain of what's steady, what's safe, what's familiar. Over time, these other things become louder than the sound. Not in volume, but in value. They matter more, they hold more meaning. And that shift in value is what changes perception. The sound is the same, but your life is bigger. And in that bigger life, there's less room for fixation. The idea isn't to distract yourself forever. It's to re-engage with the world enough that the sound loses priority. Attention naturally drifts away. You begin to forget to notice. And forgetting, in this case, is a form of healing, not because the sound is erased, but because it no longer demands your presence. Think of all the things your mind once held tightly: small fears, passing discomforts, sensations that felt overwhelming, that now barely register. Tinnitus can join that category. Not because you stop hearing it, but because you stop responding to it. It becomes old news, not worth a reaction. This ability to let go without forcing is something the nervous system does best when it feels safe. And safety grows through repetition, through ordinary moments, through familiar signals. This is why a consistent bedtime, a soft routine, a trusted soundscape, a calm voice, all of these small choices send the same message. There's nothing to solve. You're allowed to rest. In the end, tinnitus is not a barrier to sleep or to focus or to peace. It only feels like one when the mind is tightly attached to the idea of getting rid of it. When that attachment loosens, the sound no longer blocks anything. You sleep anyway, you focus anyway, you rest anyway. Not in spite of the sound, but alongside it, as if it were a small boat drifting nearby. There, but not disturbing the current, the brain will continue to adapt as long as you let it. And adaptation doesn't need your constant attention. It works in the background. It reshapes how you perceive, what you highlight, what you carry. And in that quiet reshaping, the sound that once felt central becomes a soft echo in a much wider space. Something that no longer defines your nights, or your days, or your sense of quiet. Tinnitus has a way of making you feel like something is unresolved. As if there's always one more thing to try, one more adjustment to make, one more reason it might still be there. And it's natural to think this way. The human mind is always searching for patterns, causes, and solutions. But part of the difficulty with tinnitus is that it doesn't always follow a clear cause and effect path. There is no one fix, no universal explanation. And that lack of resolution can create tension, not just in the ears, but in the mind. A sense that something is incomplete. But what if the resolution isn't in fixing the sound, but in no longer needing it to be fixed? What if the path forward isn't about erasing it, but about making peace with its presence? This shift is subtle but profound. It allows the nervous system to release its grip. The tension that was tied to the tone starts to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, as the body relearns that nothing needs to be done, that you can simply continue. And in continuing, you allow the brain to reassign the sound to a different category. Not danger, not unknown, but background. Harmless, familiar. There's a kind of strength in letting something be what it is without letting it take over. It doesn't mean giving up. It means choosing not to spend all your energy on something that no longer deserves it. That energy can be used elsewhere, in calm thought, in connection with others, in rest. And when that shift begins, something interesting happens. You stop noticing the sound in the same way. It doesn't leave, but it no longer interrupts. It doesn't need to be solved because it's no longer in the way. This kind of change doesn't usually feel dramatic. There may not be a clear turning point. Instead, it arrives quietly, like realizing you haven't thought about the sound in a few hours, or that you've just had a full conversation without being aware of it, like recognizing that you've slept deeply even though it was there, or that you've spent the day focused on something else entirely. These are the signs that the brain is doing what it does best: adapting, balancing, healing, without calling attention to itself. Even when the sound returns to awareness, you may find it no longer stirs the same feeling. It might still be there, but it doesn't cause the same rise in tension, the same frustration. It's just a part of the moment, not the center of it. And over time, these moments build on each other. The sound loses its specialness. It becomes like other neutral sensations, things you can notice or ignore, depending on where your attention is. Attention is a limited resource. The brain is always deciding what to focus on and what to filter out. Tinnitus captures attention not because it's loud, but because it's uncertain. When the brain doesn't know what something means, it watches it more closely. But as soon as meaning becomes clear, when the sound is no longer interpreted as dangerous or urgent, the brain relaxes. It stops checking in. It lets the signal fade into the background. You don't have to make that happen. You just have to allow the conditions in which it happens naturally. Those conditions are safety, familiarity, repetition, and emotional neutrality. That's what this kind of long, calm narration is for. Not to distract you, not to give answers, but to keep the mind gently occupied, enough so that it stops over-monitoring itself. Enough so that the sound is no longer the sharpest signal in the room. There may be stretches of time when the tone seems completely absent. Not because it has left, but because your attention has fully moved elsewhere. When it returns, as it sometimes will, it's important to remember that this isn't a setback. It's just a moment. One signal among many. It can be noticed without fear. It can be observed without meaning. And then, gently, the focus can move again. Over time, this becomes a natural rhythm. The sound rises, you don't react. The sound fades, you don't chase it. The mind moves freely between awareness and non-awareness, without judgment. This freedom is not something you force. It's something that returns as pressure fades, as your system regains its baseline calm. It helps to remember that your body wants rest. Your brain wants to save energy. If the sound doesn't require action, eventually the brain will stop spending effort on it. You just have to give it time. And in the meantime, you live. You think, you feel, you engage with life as it is. You let the sound be part of it, but not all of it. You let it be neutral. Sometimes the mind will test that neutrality. It might ask, is it still there? Has it changed? Should I be doing something? These questions are part of the adaptation process. You don't need to push them away. You can answer gently, yes, it's there. No, it doesn't matter. Yes, I've heard it before. And then you move on, not with resistance, but with ease. There are parallels to this in many areas of life. A scar that once felt tender becomes just a mark. A sound outside the window that once annoyed you becomes part of the background. A sensation in the body that once felt overwhelming now barely registers. The brain lets go of things once they are known, once they are safe, once they are unimportant. Tinnitus can be one of those things. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually, softly. In the same way that the body relaxes once it knows it's no longer under threat. In the same way that the mind releases thoughts that no longer serve. You don't have to rush that process. You only have to stay present for it. Each time you sleep with the sound, the brain learns something. Each time you enjoy a quiet moment anyway, the nervous system shifts. Each time the tone is there and you don't react, you're teaching yourself how to live alongside it with less tension, less weight, less fear, and eventually what once felt like a barrier becomes just another part of your internal weather. Something that changes, something that passes, something that no longer gets in the way. Tinnitus invites a kind of quiet courage, the courage not to fight, but to allow, not to overcome, but to carry lightly. It's a shift from doing to being, from trying to fix the moment to simply living it. This doesn't mean surrendering, it means softening. It means letting the nervous system step back from its alert posture and re-enter the ordinary rhythm of attention, a rhythm that is slower, steadier, and far more sustainable. When that rhythm returns, something else happens too. The moments around the sound start to grow again. You notice the warmth of the air, the comfort of your body resting, the gentle stretch of time as the evening unfolds. These things had been there all along, but when the sound was central, they faded. Now they begin to reappear not as distractions, but as reminders. Reminders that the world is still large, even when one small sound is present. This spaciousness is something the brain can relearn at any time. It does not require perfect conditions. It does not depend on whether the sound is louder or softer today. It only depends on how much room you're willing to give the moment itself, not in spite of the sound, but with it, around it, as if the sound were a single note in a much larger song. Sometimes it stands out, other times it blends in, but the song continues either way. You may notice, too, that your memory of the sound is less sharp, that when you try to recall it, it doesn't come back as clearly. This is a good sign. It means the mental model is softening. The pathways that once kept the sound in focus are no longer being reinforced. They're being gently bypassed. And with each bypass, the grip of the sound on your attention weakens. In this way, adaptation is not about removing the sound. It's about removing the need to remember it, the need to check it, the need to wonder what it means. As these needs dissolve, what remains is simply sensation. And sensation, when not wrapped in meaning, is neutral. You don't react to it. You don't track it. You let it exist and then let it pass. Even when the tone returns sharply during illness, after stress, in moments of emotional strain, the foundation you've built is still there. The system may react briefly, but it recovers more quickly. The tone feels less significant. It doesn't trigger the same cascade of thoughts. Instead, it becomes a reminder of how much has changed, of how much quieter your response has become. Tinnitus doesn't block sleep. It doesn't block peace. It only competes for space when the mind is already tense. And once that tension fades, the sound returns to its original place. A signal among many, no longer special, no longer demanding. You rest because the body knows how to rest. You fall asleep because the brain, when given time and calm, always moves in that direction. As you listen to this now, your mind may already be drifting, not because of effort, but because of safety, because the information is consistent. The tone of the voice is soft. The pacing is slow. There are no sharp changes, no surprises. And in this stability, the nervous system stops watching for what's next. It simply settles into what is. This settling is not passive. It's a sign of intelligence. The body knows when it is safe. It listens for danger, yes, but also for the absence of danger. And in the absence of threat, it lets go. Shoulders drop, breathing deepens, thought slows. Sleep begins not with an instruction, but with permission. And you have that permission now. The sound may still be there, that's all right, it has always been there, but your relationship to it has changed. Even in the time you've spent listening, that shift has already begun. The sound is still what it is, but your experience of it is already softer, already slower, already less important. There's something reassuring about the idea that the brain doesn't need to be perfect to work well. That even with strange sensations, even with sounds that appear from nowhere, the system as a whole can still find its balance. Tinnitus doesn't mean your brain is broken. It doesn't mean something is fundamentally wrong. It means that your brain, in the absence of certain signals, continues trying to listen. It's still doing its job. It's still paying attention. The difference is that it's now tuning into internal frequencies rather than external ones. And even that can be adjusted. This rebalancing doesn't require dramatic action. It doesn't require full understanding of every mechanism involved. It only requires time and a steady environment. It requires that you stop reacting with urgency, that you stop feeding the signal with fear, that you let the tone exist without giving it the kind of emotional energy that makes it grow sharper in awareness. Because the brain listens more closely to what it believes matters. And when something no longer matters even a little bit, the brain becomes quieter toward it. It listens less, it responds less. And that's when the experience begins to change. You may have noticed already that when your mind is occupied with something else, the sound fades into the background. Not always, not completely, but often enough to prove that the relationship between attention and perception is real. It shows that what we focus on becomes louder, and what we leave alone begins to blur. This isn't a trick. It's a basic property of how our senses operate. They prioritize relevance, and the more irrelevant a signal becomes, the more likely it is to fall into the periphery. That's why context matters so much. Not just physical context, like whether you're in a quiet room or a noisy space, but emotional context, how you feel about the sound, what it represents to you, what you believe it means. If it feels like a threat, the body stays tense. If it feels like an annoyance, the mind keeps checking it. But if it becomes familiar, if it becomes something you expect, something you don't have to fix, then the body no longer reacts. It no longer braces. And without that constant readiness, perception changes. This change can feel like something dissolving, like a knot in your attention slowly coming undone. It might not happen all at once. In fact, it probably won't. But you'll feel it in small moments, in the way you sleep, in the way you forget to listen for the sound, in the way you move through your day with more ease. These moments are easy to overlook, which is often a good sign. The more you overlook them, the more they accumulate. The more they accumulate, the less central the sound becomes. There's no finish line, no test you need to pass. This isn't a journey with a dramatic ending. It's a quiet return to normal perception. And that return happens in the background when the system is ready. You can support it by staying consistent, by letting rest be rest, by letting noise be noise, by letting silence include whatever internal sounds come with it, without demanding they be different. Even now, in this moment, your brain is adjusting. Maybe you've forgotten about the tone for a few seconds. Maybe you've remembered it but felt nothing. Maybe it's still present but feels softer, less important. These are all signs of change. Not because the sound itself is changing, but because you are. Because your attention is widening again. because your nervous system is stepping down from its watchful state. This is why so many people find peace with tinnitus, not through medical intervention, but through calm, through patience, through the decision to live anyway, to sleep anyway, to move through life without making the sound the center of everything. This is a powerful shift, not because it's loud or obvious, but because it's sustainable. It means that rest can return, that thinking can slow, that quiet can still feel quiet, even with a sound in the distance, because quiet isn't just the absence of sound. It's the absence of struggle. It's the state of not needing to solve, fix, resist, or monitor. And that state is always available. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to wait for the sound to leave before you can feel it. You can allow quiet to exist around the sound, beneath it, even through it. And the more often you do that, and the more the mind learns that it's possible, that it's safe, that it works, and eventually you stop needing reassurance, you stop checking, you stop thinking about it so often. The sound becomes just one element in a larger field of experience, one signal among many, no longer charged, no longer gripping, no longer holding your attention hostage. This doesn't mean you'll never notice it again, but it does mean that when you do, it won't feel the same. It will feel smaller, duller, more familiar. You'll notice it the way you notice a jacket on your shoulders, present but not meaningful. It may stay or it may fade, but either way, your peace isn't dependent on what it does. Your peace is dependent on what you no longer give it. Tinnitus will always seem more important when you want it to go away. But the moment it becomes something you simply live with, its hold weakens. The urgency drops. The body calms. The mind stops checking. And that's when the silence around it returns. Not perfect silence, but the kind that doesn't need to be perfect to be enough. The kind that includes the sound and still feels like rest. You might begin to notice something else too, that the way you think about tinnitus isn't just softer, it's quieter. Fewer thoughts around it, fewer questions, less mental conversation. That in itself is a kind of relief. Not because you forced yourself to stop thinking, but because the thoughts simply don't come as often anymore. The sound no longer triggers them. It exists on its own without pulling your focus along with it. And that's what peace really is. Not the disappearance of sensation, but the return of mental stillness around it. This is why some people describe their relationship to tinnitus like a distant memory. It's there, but only if they go looking for it. And when they don't, it just stays where it is, out of the way. It doesn't rise, it doesn't press in, it doesn't color the whole moment. They're aware of it, but the awareness doesn't bring discomfort. It brings neutrality. And neutrality is the state in which the nervous system is most efficient, most balanced, most at ease. The brain is not trying to hurt you with this sound. It's simply working with what it has, filling in the silence, reaching for completeness. When the input it expects is missing, it doesn't shut down. It compensates. And that compensation, though confusing at first, is a sign of how flexible the system is. The brain adapts constantly, not just to outside events, but to inside signals. And just as it adapted to the presence of the tone, it can adapt to the lack of response to it. When you stop reacting, it stops reinforcing. When you stop reinforcing, it starts to let go. Letting go is something the body knows how to do. Not on command, not instantly, but gradually in rhythm. Just like the breath slows when you stop thinking about it. Just like tension in the muscles releases when it's no longer needed. The mind follows that same path. It holds on until it doesn't have to. It listens until it's no longer interested. It tracks until it realizes the signal is safe. Safe sounds don't need to be removed. They just need to be recognized as unimportant. And that recognition doesn't come from logic. It comes from lived experience, from time spent not reacting, from days and nights where the sound was present, but nothing bad happened. From patterns that show the system over and over again that it can let its guard down. These patterns are built without effort. They're built by sleeping, by sitting, by noticing and moving on. They're built when the sound no longer stops you from doing what you want to do, from resting, from focusing, from feeling calm. And when that happens often enough, the nervous system builds a new model. A model that says, I hear this, but I don't need to respond to it. Sometimes even the fear of the sound fades before the sound itself does. You may still hear it, but feel nothing toward it. And when that happens, it becomes almost irrelevant whether it's there or not. Your mind is no longer organized around it. Your thoughts are no longer shaped by it. The sound is not the center anymore. It's just one more part of the sensory background. No more meaningful than a flicker of light or the sensation of air against your skin. This is the natural outcome of a nervous system that is no longer in a loop. The loop breaks not by force, but by disinterest. When the sound no longer delivers emotional weight, the loop weakens. When the loop weakens, attention moves on, and when attention moves on, peace returns. Peace isn't always quiet. It's not always empty. Sometimes it comes with sound. Sometimes it comes with sensation. But it always comes when the need to control fades. When the present moment no longer demands anything of you. When you stop waiting for something to change before you feel okay. When you let the moment be complete, exactly as it is. This is what makes long-form listening so useful. It's not about teaching new facts or giving new strategies. It's about keeping the mind company, giving it something steady, something that doesn't require work, that doesn't stimulate, that doesn't try to fix you. Just a neutral, calm rhythm, enough to keep the part of your mind that watches and waits gently engaged without pressure. In this space, your system recalibrates. It stops bracing, it stops expecting, it begins to trust that this moment, whatever sounds it includes, is still restful, that there's no need to monitor, that no new signal is coming, that nothing will change unless the system decides to change it. And even then, it will happen slowly, softly in the background. The best kind of healing is the kind you don't have to manage, the kind that happens while you're not watching. That's how the brain works when it's truly safe. It stops tracking symptoms. It stops testing the edges. It lets things blend back into the fabric of experience. And that blending is what turns a signal into something neutral, into something ordinary, into something that doesn't need your energy. And from that neutrality comes room, space for other sensations, other thoughts, other priorities. You stop giving the sound authority. You stop letting it narrate your mood. You stop making it the reason for how you feel. And instead, you let it pass through the moment like weather. Present, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, but never in control. You've already been building this state. With every hour you've spent living your life in the presence of the sound. With every time you let it be, rather than trying to force it out. The system notices. The brain logs the pattern, and over time, the pattern becomes the default. That's why many people can't say exactly when their tinnitus stopped bothering them. It wasn't a moment, it was a fading, a quiet loss of urgency, a soft shift in importance. And now that shift continues. Not because of what you do next, but because of what you no longer need to do. Sometimes we underestimate how much the brain wants peace. Not stimulation, not perfection, just peace. It doesn't ask for total silence or complete clarity. It asks for safety, for rhythm, for consistency. And when it finds those things, it naturally begins to downregulate. It lets go of hypervigilance. It stops monitoring every detail. And in that softening, sounds that once felt intrusive begin to fade. Not because they're gone, but because they no longer matter in the same way. Tinnitus is a sound that draws your attention at first. But the longer it's there without consequence, the more your system learns that it can safely ignore it. Just like it learns to ignore the sound of your own footsteps or the faint buzz of electricity in a quiet room. This is not ignoring through effort. It's ignoring through relevance, through disinterest. The brain learns what's worth tracking and what isn't, and eventually it chooses not to track this. This choice doesn't happen all at once. It builds slowly, day by day, sleep by sleep, moment by moment. Each time you notice the sound and feel nothing, the system lets go a little more. Each time you go about your day without thinking of it, that shift deepens. And when you look back, you realize the sound hasn't changed, but you have. Your relationship to it has changed. Your sense of urgency, your focus, your peace. It's worth remembering that the auditory system never stops working. Even in deep sleep, it continues to monitor. It does this not to disturb you, but to keep you safe. When something unusual is heard, a sudden loud noise, for example, it may wake you, but only if the signal is strong enough. Tinnitus, however, is not a sudden signal. It's not a spike in the environment. It's a stable, repeating tone. And over time, the brain categorizes it as non-urgent, just like it learns not to wake you for the hum of a fan or the distant passing of cars outside. This categorization is a kind of psychological sleep, a switch from active response to background presence. And once that switch has happened, the sound no longer defines the moment. It may still exist, you may still hear it, but you don't build around it anymore. You don't wait for it to leave before relaxing. You relax anyway. You sleep anyway. You live anyway. And this act of moving on while the sound remains is the real turning point. It doesn't feel triumphant. It feels ordinary. That's what makes it powerful. You stop needing the sound to change. You stop bargaining with it, and instead you give it no more importance than its due. It becomes just one thread in the tapestry, no longer frayed, no longer sharp. There's nothing you need to rehearse or remind yourself of. No affirmations, no strategies, no pressure to perform mental exercises. Your nervous system does this work for you when it's ready. You support it simply by allowing, by not interrupting the process with fear or urgency. When the mind stays open and soft, the change continues. Not forward or backward, just deeper, more complete, more effortless. It may help to imagine your experience like a landscape. At first, tinnitus is the only feature you can see. Everything else is blurred. But over time, the landscape fills in again. Hills, trees, light, space. The sound is still there. Perhaps like wind or like the distant echo of something you used to notice. But the richness of the rest makes it smaller, less important. You don't try to remove it. You simply walk through the landscape and the sound walks with you, quietly, no longer in control. This is the rhythm of recovery, quiet, natural, unforced. It follows no timeline. It doesn't reward effort. It responds to trust, to repetition, to the safety of allowing things to be as they are. And in that safety, the brain thrives. The body rests. The mind loosens. And even if the sound remains, it loses its grip because the mind is no longer organized around it. The day isn't shaped by it. The evening isn't clouded by it. And the night is no longer spent negotiating with it. The sound is there, but the silence has returned around it. Not a silence without sensation, but a silence without struggle. And it's in that kind of silence that the nervous system restores itself, that the deeper layers of perception reorganize, that your sleep deepens, that your thoughts slow, that your sense of space widens. And with every hour spent in that silence, the silence that includes the sound, your system becomes more stable, more capable of releasing old habits, of choosing not to respond, of hearing something and doing nothing. That nothing is powerful. It's not neglect. It's not apathy. It's the active choice to leave something unreacted to allow it to pass through you without shaping you. And that is what makes the difference between noise and rest, between a signal and a stressor, between tinnitus and peace. You've already made progress toward that state. Even now, your brain is shaping this moment not around, the sound, but around the stillness, around the rhythm of the voice, around the absence of demand. And that shaping will continue whether or not you're aware of it, because that's what your brain is made to do. It adapts, it learns, it finds what doesn't need to be tracked and lets it go. Not instantly, not perfectly, but inevitably. There's a quiet transformation that happens when you stop resisting a sound. At first, it may seem subtle, almost too subtle to notice. A few more minutes pass without checking. A short moment of peace that arrives without invitation. A realization later in the day that the tone was there, but it didn't hold your attention. These aren't dramatic shifts. They don't announce themselves, but they are real and they are meaningful. Because each of those moments is a sign that your nervous system is adapting, that it's letting the sound become ordinary, something that no longer needs a response. You may start to notice other sounds again, the gentle creak of a floorboard, the distant hum of traffic, the softness of your own breath. These sounds were always there. But when tinnitus felt central, they faded to the background. Now, as your relationship to the tone changes, those sounds return. And their return brings balance. It reminds your system that perception is wide, that your focus can be broad again, that there's more to listen to than just what's inside. This widening of perception is one of the final signs of adjustment. It means that attention is no longer locked in a loop. It's no longer circling the same signal. It's moving again, naturally, easily, without effort. And when attention moves freely, you feel more present, more capable, more like yourself. You're not managing the sound anymore, you're just living. And the sound is living with you quietly in the background. Even when you become aware of it again, the moment is different. You may notice it and then just as easily forget. It may return, but without any sense of disruption. The tone no longer carries the same weight. It's just there. Not as an obstacle, not as a problem, just one of many sensory threads in a much larger fabric of experience. And when the mind becomes used to that fabric, it stops needing to adjust it. It stops scanning for differences. It stops questioning. There's a kind of mental stillness that comes with this, not silence in the external sense, but but stillness in the way you relate to your environment. A decrease in mental commentary, in analysis, in tracking. The tone may be present, but the mind is no longer narrating its presence. It's simply moving forward. This is why people often say they forget their tinnitus. Not that it disappears, but that it loses meaning. It stops being the main character in their internal dialogue. They remember it only when reminded, and even then they feel little about it. No frustration, no urgency, just the quiet acknowledgement of something familiar. Like passing a familiar street sign you no longer read. This is not something you achieve through control. It's not something you will into existence. It happens naturally when the nervous system has had enough safe repetition, enough calm nights, enough uneventful days, enough moments where the tone was there, and nothing followed, no tension, no alarm, no consequence. You've given your brain those moments, even if you didn't notice them, even if you were unsure, even if part of you wondered if it was working. Your brain has been learning all along. It has been watching, updating, rebalancing. The part of your mind that listens inwardly has been gradually releasing its grip, letting go of the need to protect you from something that was never truly harmful. And now you're approaching a new state. Not silence, but steadiness. Not control, but comfort. The tone hasn't changed, but your system has. You respond differently now, you carry it differently, you no longer build your day around it, and in that change, you reclaim something that may have felt lost. You reclaim the ability to focus freely, to rest deeply, to exist without explaining, to move through time without resistance. This is what healing often looks like. Not dramatic relief, but ordinary peace. The kind of peace that feels unremarkable because it's so natural, so expected. The kind that doesn't draw attention to itself. You might not even realize it's arrived until you look back and notice how much quieter your thoughts have become. How much less you're checking, how much easier your rest feels. And when you do notice that shift, you don't need to celebrate it, you just live in it. You let it continue. You give it space to deepen. Because the system is still adjusting, still refining, still making sure this new pattern holds. And it will. With time, it becomes even more automatic, even more background until the tone is just another part of your sensory environment. Like light, like movement, like temperature. Present, but not defining. That's the end goal. Not perfection, not silence, not the total removal of all sensation. Just balance, just rest, just the freedom to think about other things again, to go long stretches without remembering, to hear the sound without following it, to have a full night's sleep without effort, and a full day without the sound taking up more than a passing thought. That is already happening. Even now, even here. In the quiet pacing of this narration, your system is unwinding, not in sudden shifts, but in soft waves. It may not feel like progress, but it is. The brain is always listening, always learning, always shaping experience. And the message you're giving it now is simple. This sound does not require protection. It does not signal danger. It can be noticed without being feared. It can be present without being central. That message is being received. And with each breath, each hour of rest, each return to calm, the tone becomes just a little less important. Not erased, not fought, just left alone. Quietly, gently, peacefully. The brain, over time, learns to trust what is repeated and uneventful. When a signal appears again and again without consequence, without disruption, without danger, it begins to blend into the background of experience. And with tinnitus, that's what is happening now. You've lived with the sound through days that were normal, through evenings that were restful, through nights where sleep still came. And with each one, the meaning of the sound has changed. Not because you made it change, but because the system has stopped marking it as important. You may begin to notice that your thoughts around the sound are fading as well. Not just your awareness of it, but your concern about it. That's often the last layer to dissolve. Concern, monitoring, the low-level questioning that used to follow it. Is it louder? Is it different? Will it stay? These thoughts once seemed necessary, a way to keep control. But control was never the answer. Familiarity was, time was, safety was. And those things have already done their work. Now the sound exists without needing to be understood, without needing to be tracked. And you exist around it, not as a person defined by the sound, but as a person who has room for more than just this signal. You've made space again. Space for silence, even if it includes sound. Space for rest, even if it includes sensation. Space for sleep, even if it includes awareness. This space is where freedom begins. Not freedom from the sound, but freedom from its influence, its ability to shape your mood, your attention, your state of being. And in that freedom, you start to feel more like yourself again, less narrowed, less focused on fixing something, more open, more at ease. The sound may return to your attention now and then. That's not failure. It's not regression. It's just movement. The mind is always moving. Awareness flows. And sometimes it brushes against familiar things. But brushing against is not the same as being caught by. You can notice and then keep going. You can hear and still feel calm. You can sense the tone and still feel free. This is the shape of a mind that has let go. Not forgotten, but released. Not silenced, but softened. And this softness is what carries you forward. Not into perfect silence, but into something better. Natural quiet. The kind that makes room for everything. Thoughts, sensations, sleep, sound, without needing any of them to disappear. You've been teaching your system that this sound is ordinary, and your system has been learning. Gently, steadily, without praise, without measurement, just through repetition, through lived experience, through the quiet unfolding of many uneventful moments. That's how nervous systems change. Through what they live, not what they try to achieve. And now you've lived enough of those moments that the change is taking hold. You're no longer waiting for peace. You're already in it. Maybe not all the time. Maybe not every hour. But enough. Enough that you can feel the difference. Enough that you know how far you've come. Not because the sound is gone, but because it no longer controls the moment. This is the place you were always moving toward. Not a silent place, but a safe one. Not a perfect one, but a steady one, where the mind is no longer watching itself, trying to predict what the sound will do. It's just moving through time with the sound in the background and everything else in the foreground. The warmth of a blanket, the weight of your body, the way the air settles around you, the way the day fades into night. All of these things were always here. And now you can feel them again. Because the sound has stepped back. The space around it has grown larger. The silence, in its own way, has returned. There's something quietly remarkable about how the mind forgets. Not by erasing, not by deleting, but simply by not returning. It stops circling around the same idea. It stops sending attention to the same place. And eventually, the thing that once felt so present becomes distant. Not gone, but far enough away that it no longer shapes the moment. Tinnitus can become that distant. The tone may still be audible from time to time. It may still be part of your internal landscape, but it no longer speaks so loudly. It no longer invites response. It no longer holds your focus. Instead, your mind is full of other things again, small things, ordinary things, the way sunlight moves across the wall, the texture of a blanket, the rhythm of breathing, the shape of a quiet thought that leads nowhere in particular. These details, once blurred by attention drawn inward, begin to return. And they return not because you tried harder, but because you stopped trying to control. You made space, and the mind filled it with what was always waiting underneath the noise. You might not even be sure when the change began. That's how this kind of shift often works. It unfolds without ceremony, without a moment of clarity. It's something you realize in hindsight, that you're no longer thinking about the sound as often, that it doesn't bother you in the same way, that you've stopped checking, that you've stopped waiting for something to be different. The sound is still there, but you're no longer inside it. And now the mind is allowed to wander again, to drift across ideas, to settle into stillness, to remember what rest feels like without qualification. The kind of rest that isn't a break from something, but a return to something. The tone of tinnitus, if it remains at all, becomes part of that stillness. Not because it's quiet, but because your relationship to it is. This change is not linear. There may still be times when the sound feels closer, when awareness sharpens again. That's all right. It's just awareness doing what it always does, shifting, adjusting, rising and falling. These moments don't undo the peace that has already taken hold. They're just part of the flow, like a wave that returns, only to settle again. The nervous system doesn't forget what it's learned. It remembers how to soften. It remembers how to sleep. And it returns there more easily, more naturally with each passing night. You are no longer reacting. You are no longer negotiating. You are no longer in the loop of tension. And even when the sound is noticed, it no longer carries weight. It passes through awareness like a breeze through an open window. Present, but already moving on. That is the sign of healing. Not that the sound is gone, but that it no longer holds meaning. That it no longer shapes your emotional state. That you no longer feel compelled to respond. This is how the mind reclaims its space. Not through force, but through time, through repetition, through the absence of struggle. And now, sleep arrives more easily, not because you push the sound away, but because you stopped holding it so tightly. You let it exist. You let it fade. You let it be ordinary. And in doing so, you reminded your system of what it always knew, that rest is possible, even with sound. There's something gentle in this kind of ending, the kind that doesn't need to resolve, but simply fades. The sound that once felt central is now just one part of a wider stillness. The mind no longer holds it tightly. The body no longer braces against it. And in that softening, there is rest. You've given your nervous system the chance to relearn what safety feels like, what quiet means. Not in the absence of all sound, but in the absence of conflict. No inner pushing, no mental searching, just being, just breathing, just allowing the moment to be whole as it is. This is where peace begins. Not with silence, but with the decision that nothing else is needed. that the sound can exist and you can rest anyway, that your thoughts can come and go without needing to fix, analyze, or resist, that your breath can continue its rhythm while the world fades softly in the background. You're not waiting anymore, not for sleep, not for quiet, not for change. You're already in the space where none of those things are required, where nothing is missing. And now, the mind continues gently on its way, in no rush, with nothing to solve, with only softness left. And so this narration comes to a close. The sound may still be there, or it may already feel far away. Either way, there's nothing more to manage, nothing to fix. Just a little more space around the moment, a little more ease in the quiet. There is no next step, no task to complete. Only this, and the soft rhythm of rest that asks nothing of you at all. Sleep well,